in. And our opening prayer will be, or naturally, it has to be one of St. Francis's prayers. So we'll do the best known, the Canticle of the Sun, or in Italian, it's known as the Canticle of the Creatures, the Cantica delle Creature. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Most high, all-powerful, good Lord, yours are the praises, the glory, the honor, and all blessing. To you alone, most high, do they belong, and no man is worthy to mention your name. Be praised, my Lord, through all your creatures, especially through my Lord, brother, Son, who brings the day, and you give light through him, and he is beautiful and radiant in all his splendor. Of you, most high, he bears the likeness. Praise be you, my Lord, through sister moon and the stars. In heaven you formed them clear and precious and beautiful. Praised be you, my Lord, through brother wind, and through the air cloudy and serene, and every kind of weather through which you give sustenance to your creatures. Praised be you, my Lord, through sister water, which is very useful and humble and precious and chaste. Praised be you, my Lord, through brother fire, through whom you light the night, and he is beautiful and playful and robust and strong. Praise be you, my Lord, through sister Mother Earth, who sustains us and governs us, and who produces varied fruits with colored flowers and herbs. Praise be you, my Lord, through those who give pardon for your love, and bear infirmity and tribulation. Blessed are those who endure in peace, for by you, most high, they shall be crowned. Praised be you, my Lord, through our sister bodily death, from whom no living man can escape. Woe to those who die in mortal sin. Blessed are those who will find your most holy will, and for the second death shall do them no harm. Praise and bless my Lord, and give him thanks, and serve him with great humility. Amen. And I thought I would also read it in the original. That St. Francis is one of the very few medievals that doesn't write in Latin, that writes in his natural native tongue, that writes in his vernacular. And it's an interesting fact of Italian literary history that the Cantica delle Creature is basically the first lyric poem that we have in Italian. And it's St. Francis's prayer. So since St. Francis is unique in the sense that we can hear the original language that he thought and prayed in, I thought it would be worthwhile just to at least hear the sounds of it. Altissimo, onnipotente, buon Signore, tue sole laude, la gloria e l'onore e ogni benedizione. A te solo, Altissimo, sen confanno, e nullo uomo è ne degno di te mentovare. Laudato sia, mi Signore, con tutte le tue creature, specialmente messo lo frate sole, lo quale è giorno, e illumini noi per lui. Ed ello è bello e radiante con grande splendore, di te, Altissimo, porta significazione. Laudato sia, mi Signore, per sola luna e le stelle, in cielo l'hai formate clarite e preziose e belle. Laudato sia, mi Signore, per frate vento e per aere e nubilo e sereno e ogni tempo, per lo quale alle tue creature dai sostentamento. Laudato sia, mi Signore, per soracqua, la quale è molto utile e umile e preziosa e casta. Laudato sia, mi Signore, per frate fuoco, per lo quale illumini la notte, ed ello è bello e iocondo e robusto e forte. Laudato sia, mi Signore, per sora nostra madre terra, la quale ne sustenta e governa e produce diversi frutti con colorite fiori e erba. Laudato sia, mi Signore, per quelle che perdonano per lo tuo amore e sostengo infermità e tribolazione. Beati quelle che il sosterranno in pace, car da te, Altissimo, saranno incoronati. Laudato sia, mi Signore, per sora nostra morte corporale, della quale nullo uomo vivente può scappare. Guai a quelle che morranno nelle peccate mortali. Beati quelli che troverà nelle tue santissime volontati, che la morte seconda non il farà male. Laudate e benedicite mi Signore, e ringraziate e serviateli con grande umilitate. Amen. All right, so we've got our lecture on St. Francis. And just trying to figure out what exactly to say about him in only 2 hours. St. Francis is, I mean, since from when he was alive until this very day, he's always been just an absolutely fascinating character. It's presented as a fact, I don't know whether this is true or not, that there's been more academic writing on St. Francis than any other human being. That the bibliography of things written about St. Francis is longer and more in depth than for anyone who has ever lived. So trying to pick out what is the most important and useful in 2 hours is my challenge. I hope what I present is what you're looking for. We'll begin here with Matthew 10, 5 through 15. This is traditionally the verses that St. Francis heard when, after several years of sort of preparation for conversion, it was hearing this gospel that clarified to him his particular vocation, his particular spiritual journey, his particular calling. Jesus sent out these 12 after instructing them thus: do not go into pagan territory or enter a Samaritan town. Go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. As you go, make this proclamation: the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Cure the sick, raise the dead, cleanse lepers, drive out demons. Without cost you have received, without cost you are to give. Do not take gold or silver or copper for your belts, no sack for the journey, or a second tunic, or sandals, or walking stick. The laborer deserves his keep. Whatever town or village you enter, look for a worthy person in it and stay there until you leave. As you enter a house, wish it peace. If the house is worthy, let your peace come upon it. If not, let your peace return to you. Whoever will not receive you or listen to your words, go outside that house or town and shake the dust from your feet. Amen, I say to you, it will be more tolerable for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah on the day of judgment than for that town. And when St. Francis heard these words, he had that moment of clarity that these words represented what his mission in life was to be. The earliest community that he had, the rules that they had for that community was above all to follow in the footsteps of Christ as literally as possible, following these very injunctions. And that is what basically the last 20 years of his life, last 18 years of his life, ends up being. With St. Francis, since his life is so well documented, I don't know if there's anyone in the 13th century whose life is as clearly documented as St. Francis. Which doesn't mean that we understand it perfectly and that we know when everything happened. But as far as being able to follow him almost step by step his entire adult life, it's extremely rare to be able to do that to anybody from this period. So I thought we would begin with a summary of his life that was written almost 100 years after his death. The summary that Dante Alighieri provides in the Divine Comedy. And we don't encounter St. Francis in this part of the Divine Comedy, but rather the great Dominican saint, St. Thomas Aquinas, gives a narration of the life of Francis. The providence that governs all the world with wisdom so profound, none of his creatures can ever hope to see into its depths. In order that the bride of that sweet groom, who crying loud espoused her with his blood, might go to her beloved made more secure within herself, more faithful to her spouse, ordained 2 noble princes to assist her on either side, each serving as a guide. So the 2 are Francis and Dominic that come into the world at almost exactly the same time and carry out a very similar mission, um, with very similar goals, but very different methods and very different approaches. And as Dante saw, and it was with the intention, their missions were with the intention that this is how God would renew his church. And that's what ends up happening with those two just incredibly widespread movements. The initial growth of the Franciscan order is almost impossible to believe. That within 10 years, St. Francis goes from having a companionship of 11 followers to literally a group of 5,000 that he was not quite expecting at the second general chapter. One of the two shone with seraphic love. The other, through his wisdom, was on earth the splendor of cherubic radiance. Now I shall speak of only one, for praise of one, no matter which, is praise of both, for both their labor served a single end. Between the topine and the stream that flows down from that hill the blessed Ubaldo chose, a fertile slope hangs from a lofty mountain, which sends Perugia gusts of cold and heat through Portasole, and behind it Gualdo grieves with Nocera for their heavy yoke. Born on this slope where steepness breaks the most, a sun rose to the world as radiantly as this sun here does sometimes from the Ganges. Thus, when this town is named, let none call it Assisi, for that word would not suffice. Much more precise a word is Orient. A little wordplay there. Assisi, in one of its forms, is Assisi, which is Latin, the Latin word ascendere, to rise. So Dante's making a play about the new sun that's rising up in this land that is St. Francis. Only a few years after he had risen did his invigorating powers begin to penetrate the earth with a new strength. While still a youth, he braved his father's wrath because he loved a lady to whom all would bar the door as if to death itself. Before the bishop's court, at quorum patre, a legal term meaning in the presence of his father, he took this lady as his lawful wife. From day to day, he loved her more and more. Bereft of her first spouse, Christ, despised, ignored, she waited 1,100 years and more, living without a lover till he came. Alone, though it was known that she found with Amaclas secure against the voice which had the power to terrify the world. Alone, though known was her fierce constancy, that time she climbed the cross to be with Christ, while Mary stayed below. Enough of such illusions. In plain words, take Francis now and poverty to be the lovers in the story I've told. And Dante's presentation of this as a medieval romance is exactly the tradition. It's how Francis himself presented his love of poverty, that poverty was the one he loved, the one that he intended to marry. At one point in his life, as he's trying to understand what it is he's being called to do, his friends ask him, they're making fun of him because he's kind of going off in his own little world. And they ask him, are you in love? And he says, yes, with the more beautiful spouse than you can possibly imagine. And what he meant by that was his love of poverty. Their sweet accord, their faces spread with bliss, the love, the mystery, their tender looks gave rise in others' hearts to holy thoughts. The venerable Bernard was the first to cast aside his shoes and run, and running towards such great peace, it seemed to him he lagged. O unsuspected wealth, O fruitful good, Giles threw off his shoes. Giles threw his shoes off, then Sylvester too. They love the bride so much they seek the groom, the first followers of St. Francis. And then this father, this good Lord, set out with his dear lady and that family that now was girded with the humble cord. And the origin of the Franciscan habit, that very simple brown habit that's belted with just a simple rope. When Francis recognized his full call, he got rid of all of the clothing that he has, and he puts on the most humble garment of the most humble peasant serf in that area, which is that brown robe that he wore. And rather than any sort of belt, he chose a rope as the most simple cincture. It mattered not that he was born the son of Bernardone, nor did he feel shame when people mocked him for his shabbiness. but he announced the way a king might do, his hard intent to innocent, who gave the seal establishing his holy order. The souls who followed him in poverty grew more and more, and then this Archimandrite, whose wonder-working life were better sung by heaven's highest angels, saw his work crowned once again, now by Honorius, through inspiration of the Holy Spirit. Then, in the haughty presence of the Sultan, urged by a burning thirst for martyrdom, he preached Christ and his blessed followers. But finding no one ripe for harvest there, and loath to waste his labors, he returned to reap a crop in the Italian fields. And we're familiar with the story of St. Francis and the Sultan. This had been a long project. When he finally reached the Sultan in either 1219 or 1220, this was a project that he had had in mind for at least 8 years, and he had already tried it twice, but for various reasons had to turn back his desire to try to convert Muslims. Then on bare rock between Arno and Tiber, he took upon himself Christ's holy wounds, and for 2 years he wore this final seal. When it pleased him who had ordained that soul for such great good to call him to himself, rewarding him on high for lowliness, he to his brothers, as to rightful heirs, commended his most deeply cherished lady, commanding them to love her faithfully. And in the lap of poverty he chose to die, wanting no other bier. From there, that pristine soul returned to his old home. So Dante's brief account of the life of St. Francis is a fantastic introduction. It hits all of the major points, which, of course, in the life of Francis, almost any part of his life could end up being the subject of a lecture this long. So my intention for us tonight is to try to go through his biography. So it's in the case of Francis, it's so well documented. And then bit by bit to include deeper explanations. And I'm imagining that this will take probably the first hour of the lecture, and then I'd like to get into the particularities of Italian society at the time that makes his story surprisingly more and less unique. So he's born in 1181 in Assisi. I'm hoping that many of you have had the opportunity to go there. If you haven't, it's one of the many Italian hillside towns founded by the Romans. It's up on a hill for protection. The modern city of Assisi is on the valley floor below. In Francis's time, that was all fields. The actual city was in Assisi. There was a small chapel down below in the plain, Santa Maria degli Angeli, St. Mary of the Angels. Now it's a huge basilica, but then it was a tiny chapel. And we'll see that plays a major role in this. But the major city itself is what's now the old city up on the hill that still has its medieval walls. And as Dante said, he's born to Bernardone, that is Pietro di Bernardone. And Pietro di Bernardone was a very wealthy merchant. He was involved in the silk trade. Silk at this time is just starting to appear in large quantities in Western Europe. Muslims had brought the practice of tending to silkworms with them in their conquests. And when Sicily was taken from the Muslims in the late 11th century, there was a group of Muslims that were kind of settled into a couple of villages in Calabria. And in the particular town of Catanzaro, they set up a silk industry there. And the silk industry there became incredibly important. At one point in time, it created 50% of all of the silk that was used in Italy. So Pietro di Bernardone, Francis's father, would have been involved in buying silk. Possibly, we know hardly anything about St. Francis's father. We can assume that he would have been involved in buying the silk, possibly in going down to Catanzaro to buy it, possibly buying it from traders, middlemen, but he took it to France. France at this point in time is the home to the big trading fairs. And the maps that I have pictures of, forgive the fact that they're kind of awkwardly photographed here. It's from the three-set book that St. Francis of Assisi, uh, the saint, the founder, and the prophet. Three huge volumes that have basically everything that was produced in the first couple centuries of the Franciscan order. What this map's showing is just the heavily populated centers, which are northern Italy and all of France, but also the trade routes that go. And this area here, Champagne, the Champagne trade fairs were the major financial centers of trade in the Middle Ages, from the late 11th century, especially the 12th century. And then over the course of the 13th century, they become less important for reasons that I'll explain later on. But in the late 12th century, we know that Pietro di Bernardone was conducting business in France, and it's very likely that this is where he was taking his silk, because that's just where the major commerce was being conducted. So Francis ends up being born into a very wealthy family. And he grows up with the luxuries. Pietro di Bernardone had 3 separate houses in Assisi. So Francis is born into a very privileged life. And in his youth, he fully embraces that. He has fine clothes. I mean, his father's a silk merchant, so of course he's going to have very fine clothes. And he's also going to have an interesting social sense of standing, because at this time in Italy, when we think of the Middle Ages, we think of the feudal aristocracy, kings, dukes, lords, barons, those who own castles, those who own land, those who have serfs under their care. In Italy at this time, those people are becoming less and less important with every passing year, and they're being replaced by the people like Pietro di Bernardone, who are amassing massive wealth, and with their massive wealth, they're gaining influence in society, much to the disdain of the old feudal aristocracy. From what we understand in his early life, Francis intends to find military glory. The particular form of government that's popping up in all of these cities in central and northern Italy is the commune. That Francis is born in this period in between 2 separate forms of autocracy. That before Francis, northern Italy is technically part of the Holy Roman Empire, and all of it is governed by appointees of the emperor. In most cities, it ends up being the count bishop. That one of the tricks that the Holy Roman emperors found out in the 10th and 11th century to ensure stable rule was to create a group of incredibly well-educated bishops that would serve both as secular and temporal authority in all of the various parts of the empire. As the merchants become more important in St. Francis's life, the priests, bishops, and other appointees of the emperor, the various marquises and dukes, they become less and less important. There's about a 2-century period in which you have a form of democracy, these communal governments. And then by 1325, all of those communal governments turn into despotism. The grand signori, autocrats, the individual families that come to dominate entire cities for centuries, like the Medici in Florence. Francis is born at a time just when these communal governments have really established power and are setting themselves up. And that's important for understanding later on some of the particularities of his role. So one of the things that this merchant class does is they start to take over the traditional role of the feudal aristocracy, which had been military service. So Francis wants to gain glory and honor by partaking in battle. So Perugia is the largest city nearby Assisi, just northwest of it. And Assisi and Perugia are pretty much constantly sniping at each other throughout these centuries. So the next time that the army of Assisi marches out against Perugia, St. Francis wants to go with them. While he's in Perugia, he's taken prisoner. While he's in prison, he falls ill. And this is the first moment in his life in which his horizons start to expand, that he has a sense of what's going on isn't exactly right. Whether there's a vision that comes to him in jail or not, we're not really sure of. Some sources suggest it, other ones deny it. But it's definitely, he's ill and he's in prison, and that experience alone is enough to have people sort of reevaluate what's important. And the way that he was living seems far less important, as he's imprisoned and potentially dying, because if you fall ill in a prison held by your enemy city, there's a good chance that you're going to be simply ignored and allowed to waste away. In 1203, he's released and he comes back to Assisi. And most likely his father would have paid a ransom to get him back. It's potentially part of a prisoner swap. But again, that particular detail we're not positive of. Once he gets back to Assisi and once he's back in his father's comfortable house, the thoughts that he had in jail just kind of slip away. And I think that's something that all of us can relate to in our own individual spiritual journeys, is that things seem incredibly important in the moment, when that moment is one of strife and difficulty. But when that moment passes, it's all too easy to banish from our memory the spiritual state that we were in which we had these epiphanies about our own life. It's so easy to go back to living this simple, comfortable life that doesn't require change, that doesn't require risk. And that's exactly what happens to Francis here. Which, I'm going to emphasize, because with the great saints, it's so easy to have this idea that there's a single conversion in their life, and then from that moment on, they go forth and sin no more and live almost perfect lives. And with Francis, that's definitely not the case. With Francis, his spiritual journey is something that he struggles with deeply for about the next 6 years. And it's this 6-year period of wanting to change, but either not being able to let go of the world completely or not knowing exactly what direction to go into, that prepares him then for the final 18 years of his life, where after he's had that moment, that final epiphany, hearing the Gospel of Matthew and recognizing that he's called to walk in the footsteps of Christ as close to that gospel message as possible. The fervor with which he devotes himself to that, I think, comes out of the 6 years where he's wanting real conversion. But that Greek word metanoia that means, the changing of our heart, the changing of our mind, it doesn't occur fully in any single moment. It's something that builds over the course of years. And after he goes back to his original way of living, there's a knight in Assisi, and that's important as well, that it's a knight. That it's a knight from Assisi means that it's someone of the feudal aristocracy, that class that socially is above the merchant class that Francis is a part of. And most of Italian history in the 12th and 13th, 14th, and even 15th centuries consists of the rich merchants doing everything they can to be accepted by the highest aristocracy. If you're familiar with the situation in England in the 19th century, in which you have the titled nobility, those who are eligible for the House of Lords, who have an official, actual title, that are losing influence to the great industrialists of England's industrial age, where those great titans of industry have more and more power and influence, but they're never quite on the level of nobility. That's exactly what's going on in Italy at the time. So he's invited by a knight, a member of the class that he desperately wants to be on the same level with, to go to a fight in Apulia. In Apulia, there was a huge battle going on, led by Walter of Brienne, against one of the pretenders to the crown of Germany, the Holy Roman Empire. Southern Italy ends up being a battleground for almost 200 years, really. It passes back and forth. For a brief moment, it's in the hands of Norman lords. Oddly enough, after the Vikings that settled in Normandy conquered England, at the exact same time, they also conquered southern Italy and Sicily. And then it passes into the hands of the family that dominates the Holy Roman Empire. There's a marriage that brings those two together, and a single heir, Frederick II, ends up possessing both the Holy Roman Empire and the kingdom of the two Sicilies. So there's always good opportunity for fighting in Apulia. And Apulia would have been part of southern Italy, close to where his father would have been getting his silk from. It would have been a land that Francis hadn't traveled to, but was very familiar with. So while he's on his way to Apulia, he has two dreams. In the first dream, he imagines this great hall, this great lordly hall. And the lordly hall is filled with armor, swords, exactly what you would expect a great knight to have. And as he's looking at this great display of medieval chivalry, he hears a voice saying, "These are for you and your soldiers." All of the armor, the insignia on all of it was a cross. "These are for you and your soldiers." Francis interprets this voice to mean that he's destined for great earthly glory, fighting in armies, because at this point in time, the cross on shields, the cross on armor, is indicative of crusaders. So he quite naturally interprets this as, okay, this is a sign that your wish has basically been granted and you're going to have triumph in war. And on his way, and he's barely even out of Assisi, he falls ill at Spoleto, which is, I'm one of those people that just absolutely loves maps, so I've included far, far more than I need here. But from Assisi to Spoleto, it's literally just down the road. If we were to zoom out and look at a slightly larger map, even here, it's nowhere close to being, Assisi and Spoleto. He's nowhere close to Apulia yet. He falls sick there again. And as he falls ill and he's recovering, he hears in another dream the same voice that gives him much clearer instructions this time. It seems that he misinterpreted the first dream. The second dream tells him flat out, go back to Assisi. And he follows these instructions. And when he gets back to Assisi, this time, he doesn't almost immediately abandon the good intentions that he had while he was sick the first time. The first time, as he's sick in the jail, he wants to change his ways. As soon as he gets back to Assisi, he abandons that idea. The second time, when he falls ill at Spoleto, he goes back to Assisi, and he's still running in the same social circles, which certainly for him would have been other children of the rich merchants. and possibly the children of the lower class of nobility that would have been allowed to associate with the merchant class. So he's hanging out with, again, the privileged youth of Assisi, but there is something different this time. He's going to the parties, he's going to whatever events they have, um, but there's little enjoyment in this for him. It's something where the interchange is enough that even though he's there in body but not in spirit, at these parties in Assisi. And this is when one of the records, one of the later lives of Francis tells us that his friends start asking him, okay, you've been coming along with us to these parties since you came back, but clearly you're not enjoying this. What's going on? And, you know, in the way of young men, they're mocking him for it. And they assume that he's in love. And, you know, of course, lovers have to be despondent whenever they're not around their beloved. That's how you know they're in love. That's just the medieval understanding of it. And this is where he gives the very curious answer that, yes, I intend to marry a far fairer bride than any of you have seen. But he doesn't say exactly who. And this is when the idea of embracing poverty seems to occur to him really for the first time. And again, it's a gradual process. And he starts living an ascetic life. That is, he starts engaging in very serious penance, abandoning the rich food and drink that he would have had at his father's house, his rich clothes he's no longer quite as interested in. And at this time, somewhere around 1205, 1206, again, we're not positive on the dates here, he goes to Rome. He goes to Rome and he's performing acts of charity along the way. And when he comes to St. Peter's tomb, he empties his entire purse. Whatever money he was carrying with him for this journey, he pours it all out, which shows the radical embrace of poverty at this point in time, because that's what he would have supported himself on for his long walk back to Assisi. When he returns to Assisi, this is when he begins to spend time in prayer at San Damiano. And for those of you who've had the blessing of going to Assisi and visiting it, Assisi itself, the major city, is a walled-in city on a hillside. It has the major entrance, the Porta Antica. San Damiano is outside of the major city. If you come out this door here, it's a couple, I'm trying to think how far it is. It's a couple kilometers outside of the main city itself. And it was a church that was in disrepair at the time. And on this map, you can see the three houses of his father, marked 1, 2, and 3. In a city of just a couple thousand inhabitants, his father's able to own 3 houses. So he goes to San Damiano, which it's an ancient church. The tradition has it going back to, I think, the 4th century. And this is where he starts going into very deep prayer. And while he's at the church of San Damiano, even as it's crumbling around him, he hears the voice coming from the crucifix. And I can't believe I didn't load up a picture of the particular crucifix. I'll put that up and we'll have it during our break, which we're going to have in just a couple of minutes here. When I do these long lectures, I try to stop every half hour, just so that you can have at least a mental break, since I tend to throw tons of information at everybody. And this is where he hears that first message: Francis, Francis, go and repair my church, which, as you can see, is falling into ruins. And Francis interprets this message quite literally. that he sees the church around him, just as he misinterpreted the dream literally, that, these arms are for you and your soldiers. He assumed literal soldiers. When he hears this message, he assumes that he literally is tasked with rebuilding a crumbling church. And I think at this point in time, we're going to stop for a brief break. If you have any questions, please feel free to put them either into the chat or the question and answer. And if you'll excuse me, I will be back in just a couple minutes. No more, it'll be no more than a 5-minute break, probably closer to 4. So thank you very much. I'll be right back. Type any questions. Okay, so looks like no questions. Let me pull up that cross. I want you to just have the visual image of what you're seeing here. I'm not sure how I quite managed to not include this from the beginning. So this is the church itself of San Damiano. That is not the original cross. It's a replica of the one that Francis would have seen. It's a very good replica. And we'll zoom in a bit here. So in this church, in this ancient church, he hears the words coming from the cross, Francis, go and repair my church. And in Francis's early actions here, you can see how the idea of what he's doing is slowly revealing itself to Francis. Again, he doesn't have the experience of immediate conversion the way that we might imagine. So kind of very much still in the mindset of the merchant son, Francis's immediate response is to go and steal cloth from one of his father's warehouses, and sell that cloth. And then he brings a bag of coins to the priest, the poor priest, who's who has the Church of San Damiano as his charge. Um, he explains to the priest how he came across this money, and the priest refuses it. The priest has no interest, basically, in being involved in a crime. I mean, Francis is basically, fencing goods and using the proceeds of that to try to repair a church. The idea isn't quite there yet. And when the priest refuses the money, the story is that Francis becomes infuriated and flings the coins at the priest and storms off. But then he runs into another dilemma, because he can't really go back home at this point, because his father is absolutely enraged that Francis stole cloth. Um, whether it's because you have the silk merchant who is furious at losing what he intends to sell, or whether it's the father who is infuriated that his son has turned into a thief, I would imagine it's some combination of both. Francis knows what he's going to be going back to, so he hides himself in a cave for a month. And this ends up being one of his first sort of extended penitential retreats. He has very little to eat for this month. He comes back filthy, ragged, hollow-cheeked. As soon as he enters the city gates, a crowd recognizes him, knows what's going on, and they're mocking him all the way until his father gets news of it. And his father grabs him in the street and literally drags him home, where he beats him and locks him in a closet in the house. But being a merchant, the father's going to be off again. And as he leaves on business, Francis's mother lets him out, and Francis straight away goes back to San Damiano's. Francis's mother doesn't figure largely in the story. We don't know much about her, but we do know is that she herself was French. Pietro di Bernardone sold his cloth at the French markets, and he was actually away from home doing business in France when Francis was born. His given name was Giovanni, but he ends up being called Francesco by his father because his father comes back. And Francesco at that time is just literally means like French boy. He's basically naming his son for the country that he does his business in, is the traditional story. There's some suggestion that he's named that the nickname honors his mother's heritage. But for me, that explanation just doesn't work as well with everything else that we know about Pietro di Bernardone. So his father goes off on another trip. His mother lets him out of the locked closet. And he goes back to San Damiano's, where he spends days and night in intense prayer. At this point, his father basically sees him as a lost cause. And so he takes him before the bishop, and the bishop of Assisi has quite a bit of temporal power as well. In that model that had been set up, that was where the bishops are temporal lords. Assisi was part of the church lands at the time, the papal states. And so the local bishop has tremendous authority in civil law as well. And so the father's intention is to bring the son before the bishop, explain his rationale, and disinherit him. He wants to cut Francis off economically completely, and make sure that he gets nothing in the future. Francis agrees to this, which we have to imagine was an incredible shock to Pietro di Bernardone. Um, what I've always thought when I read this episode and the various accounts is that this was Pietro di Bernardone doing his best effort to try to make what he considered a frivolous, whimsical son finally see the light. By saying, if you're going to continue down this path, I will just cut you off financially entirely, with the belief that, facing destitution, Francis would sort of give up his silly little games, come back, work for the father, and be the son that he wanted him to be. Instead, Francis agrees completely. One of the traditions is that he even takes off the clothes so that he can give the clothes back to Pietro di Bernardone and owe him nothing, that his debt is completely clear, as it were. And it's recorded here that he says, now I can truly say, my Father who art in heaven, that having broken the bonds of his earthly father, he's able to, literally follow Christ by leaving his family behind, and following Christ completely. There's one other thing that Francis does at this point that's really important and kind of gets overlooked, is that in the Middle Ages, human beings are not autonomous the way that they are today. Every human being in the medieval world had somebody as their lord or master. And when Pietro di Bernardone disinherits Francis, Francis offers himself up as, in a sense, a servant of the bishop, that he wants to take on a title in medieval Italy that was known as a conversus, or the conversi were people that they hadn't taken monastic vows. They were not monks, but they were people that were trying to live the most rigorous, spiritual, religiously ordered life that's possible for a lay person to live. If we're familiar with the third order Franciscans or the third order Dominicans, the tertiaries for any religious order today, they all have their origins in this medieval Italian practice of the conversus, the lay person who is doing everything they can to live a life under a religious rule. But for whatever reason, they can't join a monastery because they have obligations in this world that they can't abandon. Perhaps they have families, they have businesses that they have to partake in, that it would cause financial ruin for them to abandon a business. But they want to partake as deeply as possible in daily religious life, a life of prayer, a life of meditation. And this is where one of the things that's kind of misunderstood about Francis is that he's utterly unique in what he does. The idea of a lay person accepting poverty, living an ascetic lifestyle, trying to put themselves under the legal protection of the bishop, trying to have some quasi-official religious life and sanctioning. That is incredibly common. It's occurring all over Italy at this time. And all over Europe at this time as well. It's not just limited to Italy. We just have some of the best documentation for it in Italy. The 12th and early 13th centuries are possibly the centuries in which the laity ended up playing the largest role in shaping certain institutional elements of the church, because there was such devotion, such desire on the part of the laity to have a more religiously intense life and experience, that they kind of had to create these ad hoc positions for them. But you certainly don't want to dissuade the faithful from having a more intense religious life. But they're not able to go into sort of the approved channels of being monks and nuns. So the church shows an incredible deal of flexibility in creating the possibility for these what are called lay penitents, which would be probably the best translation of that word conversus. The laity that want to give themselves over to a life of peasant penance and worship of God. So this is what Francis presents himself as, and the bishop accepts that, which gives Francis, in all of his travels, and Francis travels all over the place, which ordinarily would have been insanely dangerous at the time, because all of these roads are just filled with bandits. With all of the trade that's going on in Italy, the travelers on these roads are quite often incredibly wealthy. By having the protection of the bishop, and Francis was robbed a couple of times, and responded to the robbery by offering more than even what he had. But by accepting the protection of the bishop, Francis makes it a little easier on himself, at least locally, to travel in situations that otherwise would be quite dangerous, because anyone who harms him is seen as directly harming the bishop, and is thus liable to the bishop's judgment. So after he's accepted this life of being a lay penitent, this conversus, he begins one of his periods of wandering. He's wandering. He actually doesn't spend a tremendous amount of time in Assisi for the rest of his life. This bit of wandering that he does takes him to Gubbio, and try to see which map Gubbio is on. Yeah, there we are. So Gubbio is about the same distance as from Assisi as Spoleto is, but just in the northern direction. And even today, quite a bit of this is forested hillside. And that's where he sort of goes off on almost a wandering penitential retreat. After that, he comes back to Assisi. And while he's in Assisi, he's not there to live. He's there to beg in Assisi for stones so that he can physically rebuild San Damiano. And after he's rebuilt the little church of San Damiano, he continues to beg for stones so that he can rebuild other deserted chapels that just fell into ruin over, decades or centuries of misuse. The most important one of these is Santa Maria degli Angeli, St. Mary of the Angels. And St. Mary of the Angels, again, is down in the valley below, which in the past was not part of Assisi. Today, it's the modern city of Assisi. This is the little chapel that's also known as the Porzioncola. It's a funny little Italian word that literally means the little portion. Later on, this land ended up, the chapel was in the care of the Benedictine order, and the Benedictine order simply gave it to Francis and his followers. And in dividing up their land and giving Francis just this little bit, they described it as a little portion of our land down by Santa Maria. So the Porzioncola, that little portion. And Santa Maria degli Angeli becomes basically his spiritual center for the rest of his life. He ends up building himself a little hut by the Porzioncola, and his first followers will end up also building little huts around this small church. And while he's living outside the Porzioncola, this is when he begins in earnest the work of charity, the work of care for the lepers. So this is the Porzioncola, which is preserved, of course, because from the moment that Francis's order grew, it gained such an incredible spiritual importance to the Franciscan order. You can see it's a small chapel. It's something like maybe 12 by 20 feet, On this side of it, there's a much later painting that has been put on it. It's been decorated. Um, and the modern Basilica of Santa Maria degli Angeli, if you've been to Assisi and you visited that and you're wondering, how I'm describing it as just a little chapel, the original building, this is the original Santa Maria degli Angeli. And then in the 16th and 17th century, a huge basilica is commissioned around it that actually holds the little chapel inside of it. Santa Maria degli Angeli it's one of the top 10 largest churches, possibly in Europe. It might even be one of the top 10 largest Christian churches in the world. But this is all far later, when Francis and his companions start forming around the Porziuncola. You have to just imagine this surrounded by little mud and thatch huts, basically. And it's the 24th of February, 1208, that while he's hearing Mass in the chapel, it's the gospel reading that we read above, Matthew 10, 5 through 15, where Christ sends forth the apostles to go forth and preach the gospel. And at this point in time, everything that's been going through Francis's mind for like the last 6 years, since he's been taken prisoner and fallen ill in Perugia, and he's reevaluating what he's doing. And he has these steps where he wants to rebuild San Damiano, and his first step is to steal from his father and then sell stolen goods. Clearly the motivation was good, but we can't approve of the method that he employed. Like, all of that thought has been leading him up to this point where now the mission crystallizes in his head. And this is where he takes off the rest of the clothes that he has and he puts on the peasant tunic. He ties it with a rope. And as he's been going around the area around Assisi, doing these works of charity, caring for the lepers, this is the point where the citizens of Assisi seem to they change their opinion about him. When he first does this, when his father takes him back after the stolen cloth, they all assume that he's insane, the way that we tend to assume anybody whose actions we just can't account for. We just chalk it up to, well, they're crazy. And that's absolutely what the citizens of Assisi did at first. But by 1208, this is 2 full years that Francis has been doing this. And Francis is now doing it in a clearer way that is just pure charity. And the townspeople, not so much if they start supporting him at this point in time, but they begin to be able to see the good in what he's doing, might be a better way of putting it. And the first followers that he gets. And Dante mentioned 2 of them. Bernard of Quintavalle is the first. And he was a town magnate. That is, he was born to one of the great feudal families of the area. Peter Cattaneo. And the Cattaneo name is important. That is a noble name. The Cattani family, outside of Rome, are one of the powerful, rich families. The Pope Boniface VIII at the end of the century comes from the Cattani family outside of Rome. The Cattano family here is an offshoot of that family. And Peter Cattaneo was a canon of the cathedral. That is, he's one of the priests assigned to the cathedral. And those priests live under a religious rule similar to monks, following the canonical hours of the day. So it's an incredibly important position. In an age of simony, that's a position in a church where simony was practiced, like it was in Milan. That position is one that a rich family would have had to pay large sums of money to be able to put their son into. So Peter Cattaneo he's an important person as well. And then the Giles that was also mentioned by Dante. These are the first 3 followers. And they go about Assisi proclaiming a message of penance, brotherly love, and peace. And it doesn't sound particularly important to us, but as they're exhorting the citizens of Assisi to penance, they're technically preaching at this point in time, which is an incredibly contentious issue because preaching is limited to those who have official license to preach from having taken either vows in a community or a holy order, vows in a religious community, or they've been authorized as clerics. So what they're doing right now is borderline, it's right on the edge of something that could get them an ecclesiastical censure. Oh, I'm sorry, there was a question about simony. So simony is the very unfortunate practice in the medieval church of selling high positions in the church for cash. Because the canons of the cathedral were entitled to a salary based on the income of the cathedral, and the canons of the cathedral would also come together, and they would have some role in choosing the next bishop of Assisi. And the bishop of Assisi had a fairly good income as well from the tithes that go into the church, and he also has quite a bit of political power. So one of the unfortunate flaws of the hierarchy of the medieval church is that the most important positions in the church were dominated by the same noble families that dominated the secular world. So if you had a family that produced dukes or bishop or knight, dukes, lords, marquises, whatever, kings and emperors, it would be assumed that any child they had that went into the clergy, they weren't going to become a parish priest off in the boonies. Their children would receive the best, most lucrative offices. And of course, that led to a whole host of abuses. And I mean, itself is an abuse and leads to even worse abuses. The great period of reform in the medieval church that starts in the mid 11th century and goes on basically uninterrupted up to the Council of Trent. The common abuses that they were always going after were priests that lived with concubines, priests that did not hold their chastity, and priests that had got their positions through simony. All of the Lateran councils, Lateran 1 through 4, all of them repeat prohibitions against simony and enforce clerical celibacy. And the fact that all of them have to repeat these official pronouncements means that they had a very hard time enforcing that for a variety of reasons. The biggest one being that before the Council of Trent, there were no seminaries. There wasn't a particular training ground for priests. There wasn't a set program that they all had to go through. Basically, if you wanted your child to be a priest, if there's a school nearby, they might take some classes in theology, but it was pretty much enough for the family to basically drop off the son they wanted to be a priest with the local priest. And they sort of became priests through an apprenticeship program. So when you more or less have an apprenticeship program in place, and the position of that particular priest is one that creates a lot of wealth for the person who has it, you're going to have immediate corruption. That's the unfortunate reality of fallen, corrupt human nature. And that is one of the things that Francis's life of penance and asceticism is fighting against. And again, it's not just Francis. There's a ton of lay religious men and women throughout Italy and throughout Europe that want these authentic, pure, ascetic religious experiences. And they go off and they create it on their own, because quite often the diocesan clergy weren't able to create or encourage that because they simply didn't have proper training. And some of them literally were in their position because their families bought their way in. So anyway, I'm coming back to Francis and his first three followers. They go through Assisi preaching penance, brotherly love, and peace. And going forth and preaching, that is telling the laity of Assisi, giving them instructions on reforming their moral life. If you're doing that without authorization, that's not something that the institutional church is going to approve of. And one of the issues that the church had with all of these groups of lay penitents who wanted to create these associations that were almost monastic, but not quite, is that in their fervor to spread their message to others, they would end up engaging in preaching, but these people had no training in it either, and they lacked the authority of the church because they had no authority. They had just sort of made themselves lay penitents. Most of the lay penitents limited themselves to trying to live the most perfect religious life that they could. But knowing human nature as we do, there's some people that are going to accept this life of asceticism and use it as an opportunity to point out the shortcomings in others. And when you do that and you're trying to speak with the authority of the Gospels, but you don't have a mandate from the church, you're opposing canon law at that point in time. And some of these groups do become heretics, and they are condemned by the official church. So recognizing this, in 209, Francis brings his group together that now has 11 total, and they come up with a rule for the community. And the first rule is just very simple. It's an expansion of follow the teachings of our Lord Jesus Christ and to walk in his footsteps. But they go to Rome. They make sure that they go to Rome, and they want papal approval for what they're doing. The same fire that lit Francis also lit many others who were burning with the same desire to live the most authentic apostolic life possible, but they didn't have Francis's genuine humility. Francis's genuine humility leads him basically at the first opportunity to go to Rome and get official church sanctioning for what he's doing. With some of these groups that decided that, they were living a more perfect religious life, when they looked at the secular clergy, the diocesan priests, and they saw lives that were not particularly praiseworthy, some of these groups came to the conclusion that, well, we're the ones really following the gospel, so we're the actual authority here, which is pretty much the definition of heresy. If you are going to say that you know better than the official church and that you are able to exercise your judgment in questions of your religious conduct because you don't accept the authority of this particular priest that you think you're better than, you've chosen then to create your own laws. And there's dozens of groups in this time period that begin with religious fervor, but lacking humility, will not accept any restraint. And they believe that they are able to set forth their own law of their own religious life that is superior to what the church can provide. And of course, those groups get marked as heretics. St. Francis, in his genuine humility, knows from the very beginning that what he's doing is something that has to have official sanction. So when it's 4 guys walking around, that's one thing. When your group is up to 11, that's a little different. And so that's when they sit down and they write up a religious rule, what's sometimes referred to as the regula primitiva. And they go to Rome for papal approval. And then in one of those moments of providence, the Bishop of Assisi just happens to be there. From everything I've read, they didn't know this at the time. It ended up just being chance. They run into the Bishop of Assisi, who's familiar with what they've been doing. And the Bishop of Assisi had approved of what they were doing. If he hadn't, they would have been censured almost immediately. The Bishop of Assisi is able to introduce them to the Cardinal Giovanni di San Paolo, the cardinal priest of St. Paul outside the walls. This cardinal is deeply impressed by this group, their description of what they're doing and why they're there. And this cardinal arranges an audience with the Pope Innocent III. Innocent III is one of my favorite figures in the medieval church. But he has some similarities to St. Francis, and in some other ways, he's just the complete opposite. Innocent III was a member of one of the noble aristocratic families of Rome, or outside of Rome, the Counts of Segni. He was Lotario dei Conti di Segni. He was elected Pope when he was only 37, and he was brilliant. Everyone around him acknowledged his brilliance. He was an extremely good administrator, and he was trying to sort of create the centralized papacy that today we take for granted. One of the major mistakes that's made when talking about the church in the Middle Ages is assuming that the Pope had practical, effective spiritual authority over the entire church in Western Europe. And that almost never happened. Just the slowness of communications, but also the fact that pretty much every single secular lord wanted to have their say in the local church. The major arguments are called the investiture controversy, where the popes of the 11th century argued with the Holy Roman emperors of the late 11th century about the right to appoint bishops. The Holy Roman Emperor had said that as emperor, I have authority. These bishops are in my territory. I'm allowed to appoint whoever I want. And the popes were trying to get the principle of, as head of the church, they have the absolute right to appoint and to dismiss bishops. And they had to fight for that because it just simply wasn't something that was widely accepted. So Innocent III ends up spending most of his pontificate trying to establish the canonical grounds, the canonical authority of the Pope in a practical way over the church. And he ends up making larger statements for the authority of the Pope that had been made before him. He had the metaphor that the Pope and the Emperor are like the sun and the moon. The Pope is the sun, the Emperor is the moon. The moon shines, and that's great, but it only shines because it reflects light from the sun. So all authority ultimately comes from God, and Innocent III presented himself as God's vicar on earth, not as the vicar of Peter, but he actually used the formula, the vicar of God on earth. So ultimately, his spiritual power was far superior to that of the emperor, and in theory, he should be able to contradict the emperor when he needed to. That was sort of his theoretical position that he's trying to establish. In practical terms, he's governing the church as best he can when you're in a feudal world. The definition of feudalism is that all power is local. So Innocent was he was incredibly well educated, incredibly intelligent, but also incredibly practical. And that is just such a rare combination, to run into people of his intelligence and training who can be practical rather than insist on having their things their specific way according to their ideas. Innocent III, in a lot of ways, was a pragmatist. So Innocent meets with the group, and informally he approves of what they're doing, and there's a couple versions of this meeting about when they met. In this one, he basically told the group, okay, what you're doing now is fine, but come back when you've grown in both members and grace, and then we'll talk about you guys being an official order. But he allows the group to be tonsured, to have the tonsure, to have that, God has given me a natural one here, but to have this part of the head shaved is a mark of authority from the church, that somebody who gave themselves a tonsure basically would have been guilty of impersonating a cleric. So when they have the tonsure, that's a visible symbol to everybody that the church approves of what they're doing. And he also gives them permission to preach, which is what they were really there for, is so that their simple message of penance, brotherly love, and peace technically could be interpreted as teaching without permission. Here they get the official approval for that. While they're still in Rome, the traditional date given is the 16th of April, 1210. A lot of the cardinals seem to have disapproved of Francis's life. They said that it was simply impractical as a rule for an order that other people could follow. This is when Innocent has the dream. He sees the Lateran palace falling over on one side, and he sees that Francis is supporting it and he's keeping it from tipping over. And it's this dream that causes him to give a more formal approval of the group, and they're approved then as the Lesser Brothers, the Frati Minori, from which they take the nickname the Minorites. So the OFM is the translates as the Order of Lesser Brothers, and it's at this point in time that they get that name. So when they go back to Assisi at this point, they have approval for what they're doing. The Benedictines give them the Porziuncola. They give them Santa Maria degli Angeli to be their particular spiritual home. This will be the head chapel for the Franciscan order. And sometime in 1211 or 1212 is when St. Clare hears St. Francis preach. And there's a couple different stories even about which church she heard him in. But St. Clare was similar to St. She actually came from a wealthier family than Francis, a more important one. And on March 28th of 1212, she basically had to escape her family palace because they never would have approved of her abandoning the family. For a family like this, she would have had the incredibly important role of finding herself a good marriage. These families cemented their ties with others through marriages. And so when Claire wants to live a religious life, she's basically denying the major role that the family hoped she would have. So she escapes. She meets Francis at the Porziuncola, that is Santa Maria. And this is where, and she has a sister and some friends with her, and this is where Francis founds the second Franciscan order, the Order of the Poor Clares. And until they can have a better place built, not a better place, but their own building, he arranges for them to stay in buildings surrounding San Damiano. 1212 is where Francis gets this idea that his job is now to try to convert the Muslims. He sets sail for Syria, and similar to his trip to Puglia, he barely even gets started when he's shipwrecked. He's shipwrecked just on the other side of the Adriatic Sea in Croatia, and he ends up coming back to Italy, not directly to the port that he left from. So he ends up taking a boat back that drops him off a little farther north, and he does a preaching tour through central Italy. And the following year is when the lord who owned the land of Laverna a mountain, gives Francis the use of Laverna for conducting his retreat. So the journey of 1212 is shown on this map. He made it from Ancona all the way across to the Dalmatian coast, and that's where it ended. So then he just turned around, came back, and recognized it as this is not the time for his great journey. Laverna is a mountain that's northwest of Assisi. As he's on his way back, this is where everywhere he goes, he deeply impresses people. Just the authenticity of his religious persona is one where he's very quickly able to win people over to the sincerity of his cause and his belief. And so Laverna is basically given to him as a mountain retreat for his use whenever he wants it. He makes use of it here. 1214, he's ready to go back out again. This, the converting the Muslims, he believes that is sort of the fulfillment of the job at this point, is what seems to be the case. The Muslims he's going to convert now are the ones in North Africa, in Morocco. Again, he starts off, but doesn't quite get here. He ends up in Spain, where he falls ill. And Francis's health throughout all this period is fairly weak because of the incredibly rigorous mortifications that he practiced. 40-day fasts, limited sleep, eating the most basic foods. It's sort of a renunciation of the way that he had lived before. So he's quite often falling ill, and later on he'll have his final illness. That's the end. But in Spain, he falls ill. He has to come back. By the time he gets back to Italy, either 1214 or 1215, and it's hard to know the dates because in medieval Italy, there were 3 different calendars that were used that started the year on different dates. Some cities started the year on New Year's Day, January 1st. Some cities started the day on March 21st, or the new year on March 21st. And other places started the new year on March 25th, the Feast of the Incarnation. So March 21st being the equinox was a traditional date. And then a lot of the more traditional way of dating the year begins on March 21st, since that's the Feast of the Annunciation. And therefore, it is the incarnation of our Lord. So when we have these dates that you're looking at, any date between January and April, you can't be certain without further research which calendar is that you're looking at. When he comes back from this trip, he brings even more well-placed followers around him, including Thomas of Celano. Thomas of Celano ends up writing the first biography of Francis. The first several works on Francis were his works. He's also known, he's given credit for writing the Dies Irae, the Day of Wrath, which is the poem that was used as the sequence for funeral masses for a long time. And as a result, it's been set to numerous pieces of music. If you hear either Mozart or I'm trying to think of his name, 18th century or 19th century Italian composer, and I'm just absolutely blanking on it. But if you hear either one of their renditions of the Dies Irae, it's Verdi. There we go. Thank you, Todd. Giuseppe Verdi. I had the V right, just not Vivaldi. Giuseppe Verdi also wrote a piece to go along with the Dies Irae. That's the work of Thomas of Celano. In 1216, we know that he's in Perugia, and it's just fascinating being able to follow his travels all over the place. And while he was in Perugia, he was present for the death of Innocent III. There's records including that. By May of 1217, the Franciscan order has grown so much that they have the first general chapter meeting at the Porziuncola. and they divide all of Europe up into provinces. They didn't necessarily have followers in all of these provinces yet, but the idea is we're going to divide up Europe into these provinces: Spain, Germany, France, England, Northern Italy, and we're going to literally send our brothers out two by two, preach our message in all of these countries. Francis had reserved for himself France, which of course makes sense given his connections to France between his father and his own name. But once again, he falls sick, and he's convinced by Cardinal Ugolino. Cardinal Ugolino had become the protector of the order. When Innocent III had approved the order, they needed to have a head of the church, or I'm sorry, an official sort of head of the order or protector of the order who was a part of the institutional church. Francis was later ordained as a deacon, but something else that we can lose in his story is the fact that when it started, this is a lay movement, that this is a lay religious movement that then turned into an order with a profession of vows and a standard religious order. But it absolutely does start out as a group of lay. I mean, originally they called themselves the lay penitents. Count Ugolino became their protector. He was a nephew of Innocent III, so he's from the De Segni family. And as the Franciscans are going everywhere, they're not necessarily creating joy with everyone they meet, because a lot of parish priests see them as sort of intruding on their ground. You're preaching, this is my parish, you're supposed to ask me for permission. And some of the cardinals in the Curia are looking at Francis, and they're very suspicious because they see in Francis some of the habits and mindsets that were also a part of previous heretics, especially Peter Waldo, the founder of the Waldensians, who also preached this life of apostolic purity. So Cardinal Ugolino, being a very practical man, convinces St. Francis, you need to come back to Rome. You need to preach to the new Pope, Honorius III, and you need to explain to the Curia exactly what you're doing so that they can all be thoroughly convinced of your orthodoxy. So this is when Francis comes back to Rome, and this is the opportunity that he would have had to meet Saint Dominic. He probably met him. Again, we can't be totally sure based on the records, but he probably met him while they were in Rome, because Dominic was there likewise getting official approval for the Dominican order. But the first time Dominic showed up, they said, well, you need to have a specific rule that your group is following. So go back to France, talk to your brethren, get a rule, and then come back for approval. So Francis and Dominic both end up in Rome at literally the same time. And at this point, now I realize I've been talking for far longer than the 25 minutes I try to limit myself to. So I'm going to pause here. If there's any questions, please toss them up either in the chat or the question and answer, or just take a couple of minute break because I've, again, been dumping probably way too much information on you. books that can be recommended on Saint Francis. Um, yeah, um, as I said, there's so many. The most difficult thing is simply figuring out where to start. Um, the best starting place might be looking at Saint Bonaventure's Life of Francis. So Saint Bonaventure becomes um, the head of the order in the late 13th century. Saint Bonaventure is the almost exact contemporary of Thomas Aquinas. And the Franciscan order by the late 13th century has literally tens of thousands of members across Europe. Um, and they're trying to sort of have like an official life of Francis that they can spread to everyone. Thomas of Celano had written, a couple different versions of it. And his versions are really interesting. But Thomas of Celano had this really difficult task. Um, he had to write a saint's life, but a saint's life is incredibly formulaic. When you write the life of a saint, it's the way that today biographies are formulaic. You can pick up a biography of anybody we want to in a bookstore, and you can pretty much guess the order of events without even knowing the name, that you're going to have a little introduction that says something interesting about something that happened. You'll start off with a major event in that person's later life that reveals something about their great essential personality. And then you'll start at birth, include the details of their birth, their parents that are necessary. And you start to show basically from birth the course their life will follow that will bring them up to this peak that you had just introduced. Biographies, as artificial intelligence comes around, having artificial intelligence write a biography would be easily the most simple genre for it to do because they're so formulaic. Saints' lives in the Middle Ages had that kind of formula to them, that you just have a set of, this is what's supposed to happen in a saint's life. So if you write a saint's life, everybody has set expectations, but Francis's life doesn't necessarily match the traditional saint's life. So Thomas of Celano is trying to balance what the expectations of a saint's life are with a very unique life. Nevertheless, his works are very interesting. One that can definitely be suggested, and it's unfortunate that I didn't have time, as I'm realizing now I'm left to 20 minutes. These things go so fast. I didn't have time to really get into any of the writings of St. Francis, but one work that we can definitely recommend, and just this series in general, this is the Classics of Western Spirituality on Francis and Clare. Um, if in this lecture you've kind of been disappointed that it's so much biography and so little of what Francis said or the stories about Francis, this is the first source to go to that helps that out. It has, like, the Classics of Western Spirituality is a fantastic series. It's really top-notch scholars that have a good ability to write, that are able to present these people very effectively. If you're one of those people that kind of has to have all of the information, the biggest set to get would be this one. We'll show that. Francis of Assisi. It's a good thick book. Volume 1 is 600 pages, but that's not all. You also have volumes 2 and 3. So if you would like to have everything there is to know about Francis and literally what everybody wrote about him in the first couple hundred years, this is the 2,000-page set that will have all of that information for you. Um, Beyond that, like I said, more has been written about St. Francis. I have one of my bookshelves right here. I'm seeing if I had that one other book I mentioned, St. Bonaventure's Life. I don't think I have it on this shelf though. St. Bonaventure's Life is available through Tan Books at a very reasonable price. Tan Books runs like $5 book of the month specials every month. Quite often, Bonaventure's Life of Francis is one of those $5 books. Um, and then the massive set is Francis of Assisi by New City Press. New City Press, if you're not familiar with them, they're out of New York, I believe, and they just put together all of these incredible editions of the Church Fathers, the old Church Fathers, but then also other major figures. So that's where we can start. Again, with St. Francis, you can literally read excellent stuff that's been written on St. Francis for the rest of your life. So we'll just start with those three. The question that we have here in the Q&A, if they're lay groups, could they have continued without Rome's okay, doing their charity work and speaking the gospel? Yes, technically. And were other groups at this time held to the same standard? There were so many monastic groups at this time. So technically they could, but things could get very iffy, because what's going on at exactly the same time as St. Francis is the Cathar heresy in southern France and northern and central Italy. And that ends up leading to the creation of the Inquisition as an institution to try to find all of the heretics, get them to give names of more heretics, and basically try to pull all of the weeds out of this garden and cast them into the flames. So the problem with lay groups here is what they're doing. If they're just laity, do they have official approval for what they're doing? And if they don't have official approval, let's look really close at what they're doing and what they're teaching and see if they are following proper orthodoxy. Because what ends up happening is so many of these lay groups don't. What happens with the Waldensians and what happens with so many other groups that are similar, especially in Italy after St. Francis, is that you have groups that say, we are living the most apostolic-like life there is. The idea that wanting to return to the Gospels is something out of the Protestant Reformation. No, that's what Reform groups have been doing all throughout the Middle Ages. But some of these groups take it to an incredibly arrogant conclusion that if I personally judge myself as being more holy than this priest here, even if that priest is objectively living in a state of sin, having purchased his office and having a concubine, that does not entitle anyone of greater holiness to say that the sacraments offered by that priest are not valid. And that's one of the things that was happening in a lot of these groups, was saying that if these priests bought their offices, then they're not really priests, so their sacraments aren't valid. And if you have lay groups going around deciding who really gets to count as a priest and who doesn't, that's obviously a huge problem. So as the Inquisition is going after the Cathars and they're looking at all of these groups, whenever you have sort of the religious virtuosi is how they're sometimes described in sociology, the people of very deep religious belief and sentiment. If they cross that line of humility and start to make official statements about their own sanctity compared to the sanctity of official clergy members. That's something that, I mean, at that point in time, they're heretics because they're rejecting the authority of the church. They're setting themselves up as their own source of authority. And that does happen repeatedly. So in theory, these lay groups could have continued without Rome's okay, but they are putting themselves in an incredible place of danger. And the Inquisition was not greeted with open arms throughout northern Italy, not because the northern Italians had any love of Cathars or had modern ideas about religious tolerance or pluralism, not at all. The inquisitors also started asking questions about all of these lay groups that the citizens of that town looked at these people and said, these are the most religious people we have. These are the exemplars of sanctity in our town, and you're persecuting them as heretics. It led to a lot of conflict between the cities of northern Italy and the Inquisition itself. And the Inquisition, given its specific role, can't back down from that. So this is the problem with these lay groups. And what ends up happening with the Third Order Franciscans and the Third Order Dominicans is that with Francis and Dominic, by accepting them into the fold the way Innocent and then Honorius III did, by giving them official approval, Honorius and Innocent found a way to take the most vibrant part of the church, which would have been these lay members who are absolutely committed to living the most religious life they can. You're taking those people, you're making them part of the institutional church. You're putting them in a position where you're working with them rather than having to keep a nervous eye on them and potentially allowing them to set themselves up as sort of alternatives to the church. So after this moment in time, a lot of those lay groups, they start to dwindle because the Franciscans and the Dominicans are able to sort of out-recruit them, if that makes sense. If you have deep religious devotion and there's kind of like a small group in your city that those are the people that you meet and pray with, but then there's an order that allows you to live a life under a religious rule, but allows you to all stay in the world at the same time. The appeal of being a Third Order Franciscan is enough that it limits a lot of these groups. Now, there's other groups that continue to pop up throughout medieval Italy. But after this point in time, these groups tend to be a little more vetted, I guess. They tend to exist with official approval. So it's one of the ways that the particular genius of Innocent in governing the church comes out, is by finding a way of taking your most devout members and making sure that you give them an opportunity for their full spiritual flowering within the church, rather than sort of setting up groups that potentially move outside the church. I hope that answer makes sense. Sometimes I get going on these answers for so long that I kind of forget where I started. So, and sadly, we only have 10 minutes left for this lecture. And in those final 10 minutes, we basically have to wrap up Francis's life, but it kind of works. After Francis goes to Rome, he gets the official approval, the second official approval. He does a preaching tour of Italy. He finally goes off, and in 1219 at the second general chapter, he says, this is when I'm going to go have my mission to convert the Muslims. There's a crusade going on right at that moment, and the crusade is in Damietta in the easternmost part of the Nile Delta. And St. Francis, we do have a map on that. St. Francis sets himself off. The Christians are camped on one side of the Nile. The Muslims are camped on the other. Francis lands, and as the story goes, he preaches to the Christian camp first because he wants to revitalize the Christians in the Crusader army. And I mean, that's his major job. Um, and then after there's a temporary truce, he goes over to the Muslim side, and he's captured by the Muslim guards, and he's taken before the Sultan. And he has the opportunity here to try to convert the Sultan. The Sultan Al-Kamil, who ends up being, I think, the grandson or the great-grandnephew of Saladin. Saladin was the great Muslim general who reconquered Jerusalem in 1187, leading to the Third Crusade. He had set up his own dynasty in Egypt, and his descendant, Al-Kamil, listens to Francis very graciously by all the accounts. He decides not to convert. Francis realizes that the idea that he had that I'm supposed to go convert the Muslims, he's presented with the reality that that's just not what's going to happen. What he does after that is he goes over to the Holy Land, and this isn't really well documented. It's possible he didn't go. I can't imagine that he didn't, but it's possible based on documentation that he didn't. But this is the start of the Franciscans in the Holy Land, and the Franciscans will stay there. And once they're set up officially in the late 13th century, they remain there to this day. The Franciscans managed to set up good relations with the Muslim rulers of Jerusalem, and they get themselves appointed as the Catholic custodians of the holy sites in Jerusalem. The Muslims, being very pragmatic when it comes to finance, recognized that Jerusalem was a huge attraction for Christian pilgrims, and they had no desire to shut off that incredible economic boom. So they encouraged Christian pilgrims. They made it as easy as possible as soon as the Crusades were done, and it didn't look like they were going to be, attacked again. And so there ends up being groups of religious that are basically put in charge by the Muslims of the holy Christian sites. And that ends up being the Franciscans at most of, I don't think all, but I think most of the holy places. That ends up being their job. Francis goes back, and we have what's referred to as the chapter of the Mats at Porciuncula, either in 1220 or 1221. 5,000 friars show up, which when they'd had their chapter only 8-9 years earlier, there were 11 of them. They've gone from 11 to 5,000, and 500 applicants show up. And when Francis came back from the Holy Land, he was a bit troubled because in his absence, the order wasn't governed exactly the way that he wanted it to be governed. And some of the new recruits weren't quite as interested in the rigorous severity that the early group practiced. But he's practical at this point, and he doesn't insist that anybody completely unwilling to follow exactly the way he lived needs to go. One of the things about Francis is he had the gift of humility. He had the ability to hold himself to the highest aesthetic standards, but not to demand that from everyone else. From everyone else, he said, this is the goal of perfection that you're looking for. But when they failed that, he was understanding and consoling and helped guide them back to the path rather than failing to understand why they couldn't do what he did. So looking at what he has here, a lot of very dedicated men who want to set the world on fire, but without his level of religious severity, he kind of steps into the background almost at this point. He makes Peter of Catania, who was one of the first 3 followers, he makes him the first vicar general of the entire order. And Peter only lasts a year. After Peter dies, Francis doesn't take over leadership himself. He gives it to brother Elias. After this, he recognizes that the brief primitive rule that they had just isn't enough. that they need to have a more thorough set of rules for the order, the regulations of religious life. So he drafts a new rule, which has been described as kind of meandering and imprecise. 2 years later, he retires to Fonte Colombo near Rieti. So this is further south of Assisi, much closer to Rome. He writes up a new rule that's revised. He gives it to Brother Elias, and Brother Elias promptly loses it. Francis goes back to Fonte Colombo and rewrites it. And on this final attempt, they have the second rule. And the second rule is approved as the rule governing the order, approved by Honorius III. And this we have the precise date on, since it's a papal document. The popes kept extremely detailed records of November 29th, 2023. Just later, during the Christmas season, this is at a church in Greccio, which is close to Rieti. This is where Francis creates the first nativity scene with live animals. So if that's one of the stories you were hoping to hear about, I hope I at least put that out for you. And then the next year, and Francis is spending a lot of this time in kind of private meditation, in penitential retreats. He has a cave that's just south of Assisi. Today it's the Eremo delle Carceri, the Hermitage of the Cells, where he spent a lot of time at. He was planning on doing a 40 days fast in preparation for Michaelmas on the 29th of September. And the traditional dating is the 14th of September, 1224, is when he has the vision of the cherubim crucifix. And this is when he receives the stigmata. And the details of this that come down are that on his right side, he has what to everyone's appearance was a lance wound, and that in his hands and feet, his flesh changed in such a way that out of his flesh, he had what appeared to be black nails, the black nails of the crucifixion. His flesh somehow transformed into this, creating the wounds of Christ. And at this point in time, he also develops an illness in his eyes, that the inside of his eyelids become hard and crusty, which is an incredibly painful condition. He loses sight. He ends up trying to be treated for that for a couple of years. Nothing helps it at all. He spent some time when he saw the exaltation of the cross, that he was at his retreat on La Verna, that mountain that had been given to him 10 years earlier. He spends time still moving around, sometimes trying to be helped, although the medical help does not work at all. In July, it's pretty clear that his condition is terminal, and he's transported back with armed guards to Assisi. The incredible fear that his brethren had is that they had to pass by Perugia to reach Assisi, because he had stopped at Siena. And what they were afraid of is that the Perugians basically were going to kidnap him and hold him until he died, so that the Perugians would then be in possession of his body, which they knew was going to be an incredible relic. So much of Francis's life is an oddity. The final oddity is that the man who preaches peace, brotherly love, and penance ends up having to be escorted by a mini army, basically, so that his living body isn't stolen by the Perugians, waiting for it to die so that they could then turn it into a religious shrine. And then on the 3rd of October, he goes back to Porziuncola. which again was the spiritual center for them. Very little time in actual Assisi, most of his time down at Porziuncola, and he dies in his cell at Porziuncola on October 3rd. Less than 2 years later, he's declared a saint by Gregory IX, who's the new pope. And Gregory IX was Ugolino dei Conti dei Segni. This is the Cardinal Ugolino who'd been the protector of the order. He becomes elected pope, and he has Francis canonized almost immediately. The next day, Gregory lays the foundation for the Basilica of St. Francis. If you've been there, that beautiful double basilica, where you have a Romanesque basilica that was built first, and then later an Italian Gothic basilica on top of that. And the 25th of May, 1230, they translated his body to the lower basilica for burial. But shortly after, on Brother Elias's orders, because this was St. Francis's dying wish, is that he wished to be buried in secret so that his tomb wouldn't end up being what he considered an inappropriate show of vanity for him in death, that his tomb would become a place of pilgrimage. So after they have the official burial in what's fast becoming Gregory's great Basilica of St. Francis, some of the first followers end up taking his body out of there and conducting a hidden burial for him. And Francis's remains were unknown until 1818, which, when they were rediscovered then, that's when they built the crypt in the lower basilica and translated those relics into that crypt. The places that are specifically mentioned in the early sources where they know that St. Francis preached at, and he preached in far, far more places, but these are the ones that are mentioned, were Bavagna, Alviano, Ascoli, Ancona, and Gubbio. And this is the Rieti that he had traveled to later. And Greccia doesn't appear on this map, but it's around Rieti. So at the end of this, we have a saint who is in fire with a love of poverty for poverty's sake. The Dominicans embraced poverty as well, but they embraced it for practical reason, to show Catholics that that the clergy of the church could be as devout as the heretics were, because the heretics, lived ascetic lives. Francis embraced poverty for an absolute love of poverty itself. He's born the son of a merchant in the age when capitalism is beginning. If you ended up hearing at some point in time that theory of the Protestant work ethic, that capitalism was the result of Protestantism, it was a thesis of Max Weber's at the beginning of the 20th century. It's a nonsense theory. It's very easily disproven simply by the history of capitalism, which begins at this time. Within 100 years of, within 50 years of Francis's death, these great Italian trading companies that had been going to France, what St. Francis's father, Pietro di Bernardone, did, they will become huge multinational corporations. They'll become banks. They realized that rather than going to France once a year for these fairs, it would make far more sense to set up branches in France, so that they can buy cloth whenever they want and sell it whenever they want. They have branches then in London, in Paris. All of the marks of what we would consider to be capitalism, rational firms looking at long-term profits, reinvesting those profits, the idea of the long haul. Those were, oddly enough, ideas that they'd kind of developed out of Benedictine monasteries, who over the course of the 9th century started running themselves as corporations. So in a sense, Francis is the patron saint of capitalism, but he's the patron saint of seeing the excesses of capitalism because that was his early life. and he rejected that early life in a way that he didn't quite understand at first. Um, and for those who sort of reject some of the excesses of capitalism that we definitely see today, I mean, his life is instructive. He does what so many want to do, what the socialists, what the Marxists wanted to do. When the Marxists want to despoil the despoilers, to rob from those who've robbed from the poor in their viewpoint. That's what Francis does in his first attempt at rebuilding the church. He takes his father's cloth and he sells it and he gives that to the poor. So the idea that stealing from the rich to give to the poor is admissible, it's simply proven false in the life of Francis himself, that is not the way to proceed. That is not what God wanted him to do. He didn't want to attain something like economic equality through theft, that it had to be approached through love. And that love that Francis has, the love that Francis is able to develop when he gets his calling, his mission in 1208, when he wants to go out to the world preaching the good news. His love of poverty is accepted then, when it's clearly presented as poverty born of love. That's one of the many sort of ironies of Francis. I mean, I was thinking about titling this lecture The Saint of Capitalism, but I didn't want people to be turned off by it, by that intentionally provocative title. And then on the other hand, we view Francis as unique, and he is unique. But the idea of somebody rejecting the world and wanting to live this way, that was not unique at all. The lay penitents existed all throughout Italy at the time. We'll notice when his father was angry with him, he wasn't confused. If Francis had been the first one to accept poverty this way, his father would have been confused by his actions. But his father wasn't confused. His father was angry. So what Francis did was something that was legible. It made sense to the society at the time, or it was seen by the society at the time. His father just completely rejected that. So Francis takes what had been a lay phenomenon, the laity that want to live this life closer to Christ, and he finds a way of making sure that that's accessible to the laity, but under the protection of the church, under the guidance of the church, so that the burning love that motivates those who want the rigorous life doesn't lead to the excess of pride that creates communities opposed to the church. So the uniqueness of Francis there isn't that he set forth on this completely new life. It's that he found a way to take this completely new life and wholly integrate it with part of the institutional church that was in need of revitalization. And he founded a way of renewing the church with his fervor, in a way that was just so wildly successful. 5,000 new brothers accepting this life within just a few years of his founding the order. And so I've gone 10 minutes over. I think I'll stop myself there. If you have any questions about this, I'm more than happy to answer this. Please feel free to email me. There's been a request for the PDF of these notes. I can absolutely send that along. It'll take me a little bit to make sure that this is in a good format for everybody. If I don't get this out within a few days, please feel free to email me. I have 2 toddlers, so my memory is most definitely not what I believe it is. Thank you all so much for attending this. And I just hope I came close to doing justice to what it was that you wanted to learn about this great saint. So thank you all very much.